My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we are going to be taking a look at Hu Shi. Hu Shi is a literary scholar. He is a diplomat. He is a philosopher. He's a bunch of different things. He's most famous for his contributions to the 1919 May 4th movement. Hu Shi was kind of a revolutionary. I say kind of. Of the three figures that dominated the revolution in thought that was the May 4th movement, Hu Shi, Lu Xun, and Chen Duxiu, Hu Shi was probably the most conservative of the revolutionaries. And I use the word conservative not in the sense of today's charged political use of it, but in the original sense of the word. He was a conservative because he wanted less change than did his two other companions. Lu Xun, of course, oftentimes he would say things that made it sound like he was wanting to get rid of Chinese society completely. Chen Duxiu was the founder of the Chinese Communist Party. He obviously was quite revolutionary and wanted to get rid of lots of stuff. Who is Hu Shi? So in the early 1910s, Hu Shi was a student. He went to the U.S. on one of the Boxer Indemnity scholarships. These are an interesting kind of historical side note. After the Boxer Rebellion, the winning powers forced China to pay them money for losing the war. This is common practice. It happened to Germany after World War I. The U.S. felt bad about it. The U.S., I believe, was the only imperial power that actually thought, this is not such a good idea. What did the U.S. do? Give the money back? No. What they ended up doing is they invested that money back in Chinese students. They created a fund that paid for Chinese students to study at universities in the United States. Hu Shi was one of those students. He goes to Cornell University to study agriculture in 1910. He switches his major to literature and philosophy in 1912 as the Qing dynasty is collapsing, and that's part of why he goes to Columbia University. While at Columbia, he was a student of America's most famous philosopher, John Dewey. In 1914, he establishes the Science Society of China in, guess where? Not in China, in Ithaca, New York. In September of 1915, he pens a manifesto on Chinese poetry. Poetry, he claimed, should be written like prose. He echoed much of what Ezra Pound said in writing about American poetry. He wrote this manifesto on a train into New York City. Hu Shi was this nobody. He was a student who was writing things that would eventually become important, but he's off outside of China in distant New York until he kind of gets his break in 1917. Nobody knows him. He's just a student studying abroad. He returns to China in 1917. He begins contributing to a literary journal founded by Chen Duxiu. That's one of the three revolutionaries I mentioned before. This is called New Youth, Xin Qingnian. This is the most famous literary journal in all of Chinese history. Let me think about that for a second. Yes, I feel comfortable saying that. This is the most famous literary journal in all of Chinese history. This is where Lu Xun published his work, Chen Duxiu is publishing, and Hu Shi are all publishing in this. Hu Shi advocates for rethinking Chinese civilization. Not all that different from Hu Shi and Chen Duxiu. Hu Shi, he dislikes a lot of what Chinese folks had always done. He thinks that old Chinese writing needs to be tossed onto the trash pile. All that old stuff, Wen, classical Chinese, get rid of that. Instead, he wants everybody to write how they speak. He wasn't the first person to say that. In 1869, Huang Zunxian, who is a poet and writer that I really want to do a podcast on, he advocated for a similar thing. He said he wants his writing to be like his speech. The Chinese phrase that he actually said is 我手写我口. So my hand writes my mouth. That's a very literal translation, but it's a very kind of clear and evocative message. So Hu Shi is not the first person to make this argument that classical Chinese, we need to dump it, that we need to write in vernacular being just you write like you speak. He's writing at a time when there's really a lot of receptivity to this. Chinese people are rethinking everything. Someone called the May 4th movement China's Enlightenment. I think there's a lot of value to thinking of it that way. Huang Zunxian, writing in 1869, he's kind of, no one's receptive to his idea, or very few people are receptive to his idea. But Hu Shi comes onto the stage in this literary journal that no one knows anything about, but is getting picked up. It's advocating all these very radical ideas. And he pens these pieces let's get rid of the way we did things. Let's get rid of classical Chinese. And a lot of people take him seriously, and he becomes famous. Hu Shi, of the three revolutionaries, Hu Shi, I think, represents the most American of the three revolutionaries. Lu Xun, I think, advocates for this sort of Japanese-Russian tradition in Chinese modern thinking. Hu Shi is very much articulating the more American perspective of China's liberal circles. There are other Chinese folks in this sort of liberal America-oriented tradition. The one that I think of most clearly is Bo Yang, who wrote a book called The Ugly Chinaman. That's his title, not mine. The piece that we are going to look at from Hu Shi today is definitely a part of that tradition. It's something that I think American listeners will find very reminiscent of a sort of American sarcastic writing, satire, but satire laced with a very particular kind of sarcasm that seems unique to Anglophone tradition. That is, in the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, those countries that speak English as a native language will, I think, find this surprisingly comfortable, maybe a very American piece. It's critical of China. It uses sarcasm. Sarcasm it's not really an important part of the Chinese literary tradition. The piece that we're going to talk about today is called 差不多先生, Mr. 差不多. Now, those of y'all who speak some Chinese are probably already grinning at this name. 差不多 is a phrase that's very common in Chinese. It's one of my favorite phrases in Chinese. It means something like almost, close enough, good enough. If you're almost done with something, you can say 差不多, 我差不多了. I'm going to translate this name as Mr. Close Enough, but just keep in mind his Chinese name is 差不多先生. What is this story about? It's about a guy whose family name is Cha. His given name is Buduo. Hu Shi portrays Mr. Close Enough, 差不多先生. He portrays him as representing some sort of quintessential Chineseness. You know what? I'm already talking too much about this. Let me just let Hu Shi do the talking. I'm going to read a couple of passages and just kind of talk about them. 你知道中国最有名的人是谁？提起此人，人人皆晓。初出闻名，他姓查，名不多，是各省各县各村人系。你一定见过他，一定听过别人谈起他。差不多先生的名字天天挂在大家的口头，因为他是中国全国人的代表. Okay, here's my translation of that. And I'm not going to bore y'all with the Chinese for any of these other passages, but I thought that it was important to kind of get the rhythm of the piece. It's a very kind of punchy piece, and you can hear that in the original Chinese. Okay, here's my translation. Do you know who China's most famous person is? As soon as you mention this person, everyone knows him. They've all heard of him. His last name is Cha. His first name is Buduo. He's a native of a bunch of different provinces, counties, and villages. You have certainly met him. You've certainly heard other people talking about him. Mr. Close Enough. Every day he is on the lips of the people because he is the person who best represents China as a country. So already you can kind of hear the sharpness that Hu Shi is setting up, both in that kind of staccato, punchy prose, but also in the way he's setting him up as a symbol of China. Hu Shi has not yet sprung the trap. We still don't know what the joke is. I mean, if we're reading his name, we probably have some idea of what the joke is, but he still hasn't really kind of explained things. But you can already sense that something's coming. The problem with Mr. 差不多 is, of course, that he's too, 差不多. Everything he does, he's 差不多. Here's a passage. He has a job at a bank or something like that. He keeps making one mistake and not seeing what the big deal is because he's 差不多. Okay, here's my translation of a later passage in this short piece. Afterwards, he did accounting work in a banking house. He could write, he could count, but he could not do it meticulously. 10 he often wrote as 1,000, and 1,000 he often wrote as 10. The manager got angry and yelled at him. He would just laugh and apologize, saying, 1,000 and 10? There's only one stroke difference in the character. Isn't that 差不多? Isn't that close enough? Okay, so those of y'all who know Chinese, Y'all are probably laughing at this already. The character in Chinese for qian, that is 1,000, and shi, that is 10, those are pretty much the same character, but 1,000 has an extra stroke up on top if you take a look at it. So it's not that much of a difference, especially if you're not being meticulous. It's easy to mix those up. For a bank, this is a big difference. You can't just be 差不多 when you're calculating these sums. You have to be meticulous. And these things that appear small, they're the things that one has to be very concerned about. Okay, I'm going to read another passage. One day, he had an urgent matter. He had to take a train to go to Shanghai. He leisurely walked to the train station. He was 2 minutes late. The train had already left. He vainly stared, looking at the smoke of the faraway train, and shook his head, saying, I guess I will have to go tomorrow. Going tomorrow and going today. Are they not close enough? Are they not 差不多? But is the train company not taking things too seriously? Leaving at 8:30, is that not pretty much the same thing as leaving at 8:32? He said this as he slowly walked home, and in his heart, he could not figure out why the train had not waited 2 minutes for him. This passage really gets at the heart of the piece. Mr. Close Enough has this urgent matter. He needs to take the train. Apparently, there's only one a day. He doesn't rush to the station, but he lollygags, showing up 2 minutes late, 2 minutes after the train has left, and he does not understand why the train couldn't wait for him. Again, Hu Shi is writing about Chinese people in the 1910s, the 1920s, and how they're unable to adapt to the needs of a modern society, particularly the need to be meticulous about certain things that maybe before weren't necessary. Okay, here is the passage where Mr. Close Enough dies. And I think, like the train passage, it's very indicative of what Hu Shi is trying to get at. One day, he came suddenly down with a nasty sickness. He quickly got his family to go bring Dr. Wang from East Street. The family members rushed, running, and momentarily could not find the Wang of East Street. So he brought the veterinarian named Wang from West Street. Side note, these two Wangs are slightly different characters. They're both common last names in China, though. Okay. Mr. 差不多 was sick in bed, and he knew that they had found the wrong person, but his sickness was severe. His body hurt. He felt anxious. He could not wait, and in his mind he thought, Dr. Wang is close enough to Dr. Wang. Let him do a bit of an exam. Who cares? Then the veterinarian approached his bed, and he tried to cure Mr. Close Enough using methods for curing cows. Within an hour, Mr. Close Enough had breathed his last breath. As Mr. Close Enough was dying, he haltingly said, living people, dead people, aren't they all almost the same? Aren't they all 差不多? Aren't all things 差不多? Why do we need to be so meticulous? When he finished this sentence, he just died. Okay, so this is hilarious. First off, my wife, who's the final editor of this podcast, is a veterinarian, so I'm sure she's grinding her teeth listening to this. But if we take Hu Shi's point, it's pretty funny. Mr. Close Enough needs a doctor. He goes to Dr. Wang over East Street, but he says he's fine with Dr. Wang, the vet from West Street. He gets pumped with cow medicine. It quickly kills him. And at the very end of his life, he's still holding on to this claim that close enough is good enough, 差不多. The last line of the story is haunting, and it gets to the main point of this piece. Here it is. His fame spread far and wide. The more time went on, the bigger that fame became. Numerous people all studied his style. Thus everybody became Mr. Close Enough. Then from this, China will become a nation of layabouts. So Hu Shi is criticizing China. He makes it very clear. He's criticizing China for being a nation of Mr. 差不多. And this is going to make China into a nation where everyone is late, where no one is able to get things done, and they can't deal with these kind of things that have to be dealt with in a meticulous manner. I think this piece is really fascinating because if you think about it, there's a much more famous piece that comes out of Chinese literature by Hu Shi's sometimes friend Lu Xun that is really similar. Lu Xun's 阿 Q 正传 and Hu Shi's 差不多先生, they're both passages that satirize Chinese society and try to say that the person who they're portraying, their character, is the typical Chinese person. Hu became the most famous character in all of Chinese literature. 差不多先生, Mr. Close Enough, he's not nearly as famous. Much of that comes down to politics. After 1949, Hu Shi lined up with the anti-communist forces in Taiwan. Remember how I said he was a diplomat? So actually, he was the ambassador for China in the UN in the 1950s when Taipei represented China in the UN. In fact, Truman actually asked Hu Shi if he wanted to become the president of the Republic of China. In a meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State under Kennedy and LBJ and an important figure in the Vietnam debacle, was sent by Harry Truman and ask if Hu Shi wanted to become president on June 23rd, 1950. Hu Shi turned it down, saying he did not have the political base to support him. But that still, even though he turned it down, it still shows how important Hu Shi was. It also shows this is a guy who's probably not going to be liked in communist China from 49 to really the late 1970s, when pretty much anyone associated with the pre-communist regime was thoroughly vilified. Hu Shi was no exception. He was largely censored out of the mainland Chinese canon because of this. Today, that's not true. He's kind of been brought back into the official pantheon of Chinese literature in the PRC. This particular piece has a Baidu page, which means Hu Shi is officially recognized, because Baidu kind of is almost an official website. But it's still, I don't think he gets the traction that someone like Lu Xun and Hu, the character, get. And I think that's an interesting comparison. This piece is also near and dear to my heart because when I wound up in Beijing in March 2007 and began my second semester studying Mandarin in China, this was one of the first pieces I read. So for me, this is actually the first work of Chinese literature that I actually read, and I fell in love with it. I think it's fascinating. Part of that's because of my American background. This piece resonates with me in a way that a lot of other works of Chinese literature don't. Not because I think it's the greatest work in Chinese literature, I don't think that, but because it has this peculiarly American feel to it. I also think it's great because it's very easy to read. I mention that because I know some listeners are studying Chinese and they're kind of midway through their career in Chinese studies. I just wanted to point out, if you're at an intermediate level of studying Chinese, I think this is a great literary work for you to actually go get your hands on and try and translate it. The language is really simple, as I think was demonstrated by that passage that I read at the very beginning in Chinese, and it's just really funny. It's a fun piece if you're interested. If you're at intermediate level Chinese, it's really good. I'm going to put the parts of the piece that I translated onto the website. Please check it out. Okay, I guess 我们差不多了. I think that's close enough to the end. Again, it's just amazing how useful that phrase 差不多 is if you're studying Chinese. If you're studying Chinese, memorize this phrase. It's so useful and so much fun. As for today's Chengyu, of course, 差不多 is not a Chengyu, but I'm going to mention a Chengyu that is in this work by Hu Shi. It's yi ming, ming hu. It just means something like one's final breath. It's used in a mocking or joking manner. It connotes something kind of like to kick the bucket. I think that's probably the closest we have in English. If you like what I'm doing, send me an email. Let me know that I'm doing well. If you don't like what I'm doing, send me an email. Tell me how I can improve. ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you like what I'm doing, check out my Patreon page at Chinese Literature Podcast. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.